Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the smell of salt air and pine resin, the distant sound of waves breaking against black volcanic rock. Somewhere across that water, the largest empire the world has ever known is watching. This is the story of the night the gods sent wind. We have to begin somewhere in the middle of the 13th century, because that is where the world itself seemed to tip on its axis. A man named Kublai Khan sat at the center of an empire so vast it strained the imagination, stretching from the frozen forests of Siberia down to the jungles of Southeast Asia, west across the steppes and into Persia. His grandfather, Genghis, had built this empire on horseback, with arrows and fire and a terrifying, almost supernatural efficiency. Kublai inherited all of that power, and he wore it like a heavy cloak. He had moved his capital to what we now call Beijing, surrounding himself with silk and scholars and the trappings of Chinese civilization, though he was Mongol to his bones. By 1260, Kublai had declared himself Great Khan. He had crushed Korea, that beautiful peninsular kingdom called Goryeo, grinding it down through decades of invasion until it became a vassal, a subservient state bowing to him, providing him soldiers and ships and grain. There was almost nowhere left to expand in the north and west, but to the east, across a stretch of sea that looked deceptively narrow on a clear day, lay something that had never submitted to him, a chain of islands, mountainous, forested, proud. Japan. Now, the Japanese were not unaware of the Mongols. Word travels on ships, and merchants and Buddhist monks moved back and forth across the sea. The Japanese court in Kyoto knew something of what had happened to Korea. They knew the kind of empire that was sending letters. But Japan in the 1260s was a complicated place. Power was divided between the imperial court, which held ceremony and tradition, and the Kamakura shogunate, which held actual military authority. And within the shogunate, real power had been quietly consolidated by a clan called the Hojo. They ruled in all but name, making decisions not in grand council halls, but in private meetings in their own homes, quietly, firmly. Between 1266 and 1273, Kublai sent diplomatic mission after diplomatic mission to Japan. The letters he sent were formal, elaborately worded, dripping with the polite menace of a man who has never been told no. One letter called Japan a small nation neighboring his great empire, asked why Japan had not yet sent tribute, and invited the Japanese to consider themselves part of one global family, adding, almost as an afterthought, that he hoped no one would feel compelled to resort to arms. The Japanese did not reply. Not because they didn't read the letters. The imperial court actually wanted to respond, wanted to engage in some kind of diplomatic dance, but the Kamakura shogunate, the Hojo clan, said no. Silence was their answer, deliberate, unyielding silence. Kublai was not accustomed to silence. He sent more envoys. Some were delayed by storms before they even reached Japan. Others arrived and were treated with open contempt, refused entry to the capital, housed at a plain inn outside the city gates, kept waiting for 5 months before being sent home without so much as a written reply. One group of envoys was taken into military custody by armed samurai the moment they set foot on Japanese soil. Their leader was eventually freed, but denied any audience with Japanese leadership. He went home furious, writing a report to Kublai that the Japanese were mannerless barbarians not worth the empire's effort. And yet, Kublai could not let it go. There was something about this refusal, this small island nation at the edge of his world, ignoring him, that burned. He began to prepare. In 1274, the order went out. Ships were to be built, soldiers mobilized. Korea, as usual, was tasked with doing the hard labor of it, providing the timber, the craftsmen, the labor, the cost. The Koreans protested quietly. They always protested quietly. It did little good. 3 types of ships were constructed: large transport vessels, swift attack boats, and smaller support tenders. 900 ships in total, a fleet that must have seemed extraordinary. The invasion force was drawn from across the empire: Mongol cavalry, Han Chinese infantry, Jurchen soldiers, Korean troops. In all, somewhere between 28,000 and 30,000 men set sail that autumn, with orders to take Tsushima Island first, then Iki Island, then push into Hakata Bay on the northwest coast of Kyushu. Now imagine standing on the shore of Tsushima Island in October of 1274. The island is green and steep, tumbling into the sea. The fishing boats are small. The garrison defending it is small too, perhaps 80 mounted samurai and a few 100-foot soldiers. They ride down to meet the fleet as it appears on the horizon, and what they see stops the breath. Ship after ship after ship, more than they can count, filling the grey water like a floating city. The samurai did what samurai did. They fought. They fought with extraordinary personal courage, one-on-one, calling out their names and lineages before combat as their tradition demanded. A ritual of honour in a situation that had no room for ritual. The Mongols did not play that game. They fought in tight, coordinated formations, responding to signal drums and horns, moving as one body. They used something the Japanese had never encountered: explosive bombs, ceramic or iron vessels packed with gunpowder, hurled through the air or launched from siege machines. They burst with fire and noise, terrifying the horses, terrifying the men. Tsushima fell. Iki Island fell. Hakata Bay was different. The defenders had had a little more time, a little more warning. The samurai of Kyushu had been summoned, and while they were vastly outnumbered, perhaps 4,000 to 6,000 defenders against the full Yuan force, they were fighting for their own land, their own families, their own temples and rice fields. They had that particular fierceness that comes from having no other option. The fighting at Hakata was brutal and strange. The Japanese found the Mongol tactics disorienting. The drums, the bombs, the arrows that flew in massive coordinated volleys rather than in single well-aimed shots. The fighting moved toward the beach, then inland, then back. By nightfall, the Japanese defenders had been pushed back, exhausted, many of them dead. And then the captains of the Yuan fleet made a decision that no one has fully explained. Whether they feared a night ambush, whether they were running low on arrows, whether the sea was beginning to stir, the Mongol generals ordered the army back to the ships. They would rest, they would regroup, they would finish this in the morning. That night, a storm came. Not a warning, not a few drops of rain, a full typhoon howling out of the northwest, slamming into Hakata Bay with waves that tore the anchored fleet apart. Ships were driven into each other, driven onto rocks, capsized. Men drowned in the dark water, in their armour, calling out in Mongolian and Chinese and Korean. By morning, the storm had passed, and the sea was strewn with wreckage. Thousands were dead. The surviving ships turned and sailed for home. Japan was stunned, grateful, and deeply shaken. In Kamakura, a young regent named Hojo Tokimune had been sitting with the weight of all of this. The story passed down is that before the invasion came, Tokimune went to his Zen master, a monk named Buko, and admitted something rare for a man of his position. He was afraid. The monk told him to sit in meditation and find where that fear lived inside him. And then one day Tokimune came to Buko, and instead of speaking softly, he opened his mouth and roared, the single syllable, Katsu, a shout like a lion. The monk smiled. Truly, the son of a lion roars like a lion, he said. Something shifted in Tokimune after that. He would need it, because everyone in Japan understood that this was not over. The shogunate moved quickly. Forts were built along Kyushu's coastline, stakes were driven into the riverbeds and shallows where boats might land, and most impressively, a great stone wall was constructed along the curving edge of Hakata Bay, a defensive barrier 2 meters high, running for miles along the coast, built by the labor of every clan in the region. They worked for years on that wall. You can still see remnants of it today, stones worn smooth by time, sitting quietly by the sea. Kublai Khan, meanwhile, had not given up. He sent more envoys to Japan in 1275, demanding finally that the Japanese acknowledge his authority. Tokimune had them brought to Kamakura and beheaded. He sent 5 more in 1279. Tokimune had those beheaded too in Hakata. The heads were a message. It was unambiguous. Kublai's response was to plan something larger than anything that had come before. By 1279, he had finally crushed the Song dynasty in southern China, the last great rival power on the continent. Now he had the resources of all of China at his disposal. A second invasion force would come not just from Korea in the north, but from southern China as well, a two-pronged assault of terrifying scale. More than 1,500 ships were gathered. The numbers of soldiers reported in historical sources are likely exaggerated, but the force was certainly several times larger than the first invasion. Criminals with commuted death sentences were conscripted. Even men in formal mourning for their parents were drafted, a serious violation of Chinese social norms, a sign of how desperately Kublai wanted this. The plan was for the two fleets to rendezvous at Iki Island and then proceed together to Japan. But things went wrong from the beginning. The two fleets had trouble coordinating. They arrived at different times, launched attacks that were not synchronized, and found that the Japanese were ready in ways they had not been in 1274. The stone wall changed everything. The Mongol and Chinese troops landed on the beach at Hakata, only to find their cavalry hemmed in by that low, patient barrier of stone. They could not charge. The samurai lined the top of the wall and rained down arrows. The battle became a grinding, ugly thing. Weeks of fighting, skirmishes, failed landings at different points along the coast, Japanese warriors who had been waiting 7 years for this moment, meeting the invaders with everything they had. Some Japanese fighters even took small boats out into the harbour at night, slipping between the anchored ships and climbing aboard to fight in the darkness. Neither side could claim a clear advantage. It was messy and bloody and desperate. And then, in August of 1281, history repeated itself. Another typhoon, larger than the first, some accounts say. The storms that roll through that part of the Pacific in late summer are among the most powerful on Earth, and this one arrived with full fury. 2 days, perhaps 3, of catastrophic wind and waves. The UN fleet, anchored in the bay or sheltering in coves, had nowhere to go. Ship after ship was wrecked. One Chinese source estimated that of the 140,000 men who had sailed, more than half never came home. The number might be exaggerated, but the fleet was destroyed. Utterly, completely destroyed. The survivors who washed ashore were rounded up by Japanese warriors. Most were killed. Some, craftsmen, merchants, people deemed useful, were spared and enslaved. Japan breathed again. The Japanese had a phrase for what had saved them. They called it the kamikaze, the divine wind, the idea that the gods themselves, or perhaps the prayers that had been rising from every shrine and temple in the country for years, had finally been answered, that heaven had intervened on Japan's behalf and turned back the greatest empire in the world. It was a story that planted itself deep in the Japanese imagination, this idea that the islands were protected, that there was something sacred about this particular land, that when the moment of absolute crisis came, the winds would blow. That story would sleep for centuries, curled quietly inside the culture. And then, nearly 700 years later, in the last desperate years of another war, young Japanese pilots would climb into airplanes loaded with explosives and fly them into enemy ships, and they too would be called kamikaze, inheritors of that 13th century wind, believing in their own way that sacrifice could call something divine into the world. But that is another story, and a darker one. Tonight, we stay by the shore of Hakata Bay in 1281, in the quiet after the storm. Kublai Khan would plan further invasions. There are records of preparations, of ships commissioned, of arguments made in his court. But they never came. The costs were too great, the memories too raw among the Korean shipbuilders who had lost so much, the Chinese sailors who had drowned in the dark. And in China, a recognition quietly settled in. The Japanese were fierce, the sea was treacherous, and this particular conquest was simply not worth the price. In Japan, the aftermath was complicated and bittersweet. The samurai who had fought so hard returned to find that there was no reward waiting for them. A defensive war generates no captured land, no plunder to redistribute. The Hojo shogunate had nothing to give its warriors, and resentments grew in the years that followed, slowly hollowing out the authority of Kamakura. The great stone wall, built with such sacrifice, became a monument to both courage and the strange cruelty of history, that doing the right thing is not always enough to save your position. And on the shores of Korea, the forests were quieter than they had been. Too much timber had been cut for too many ships. The landscape carried the mark of all that preparation, all those vessels built and lost. What remains, across all of it, is something harder to name. The sense that the world hung on a turning point in those two storms, that the shape of the modern world was nudged in a different direction by wind and water. The Mongol Empire had reached its eastern limit. Japan had found something about itself, a story of endurance and divine favour that would echo forward through centuries. The waves still come into Hakata Bay the same as they always have, grey-green and slow, folding over the black rocks on the shore. If you were to walk there now in the early morning, before the city wakes, before the ferries begin to move, you might find a kind of silence that feels older than it should. Salt air and pine resin, the distant sound of water. There is a Zen temple not far from where the wall once stood. Inside, monks have been rising before dawn for centuries, striking the bell, letting the sound move outward across the city, across the bay, out toward the water where all of that history rests. Let that sound carry you now, low and resonant, spreading and fading. The bell, the water, the wind moving through the pines above the old stone. You are safe. You are warm. Whatever great forces move in the world tonight, they are distant, and you are here, and all is well. Sleep now.